The darkness inside Stillwater Caverns was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in from all sides. On March 14, 2011, the only light came from the headlamp of Leo Miller, a seasoned caver whose methodical movements betrayed a deep respect for the subterranean world. Water dripped from ancient stalactites, each drop echoing in the vast, silent chamber like a ticking clock counting away the centuries. Leo was navigating a tight squeeze, a passage most explorers avoided, when his light caught something unnatural. It wasn't rock or crystal, but a rectangular shape, wedged tightly into a high crevice, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there for safekeeping. It was a book, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, miraculously preserved from the perpetual dampness of its tomb. With careful, practiced fingers, Leo worked the object free. It was a field notebook, its leather cover stiff and warped by time and moisture. The oilcloth had largely protected it, but the edges were frayed and stained with mud. He gently opened it, his breath catching in his throat as the beam of his lamp illuminated the pages. They were filled with precise, elegant handwriting, interspersed with intricate geological diagrams and cartographic sketches of the very cavern system he was in. On the inside cover, faded but still legible, was a name, Eleanor Vance. The name resonated with local lore, a ghost story told to warn new cavers. A cartographer who had walked into this very cave 18 years ago and had never walked out. October 12, 1993. Eleanor Vance had entered Stillwater Caverns with an almost spiritual sense of purpose. At 35, she was a brilliant geologist, a rising star in the field of speleology, driven by an insatiable curiosity to map the unknown. This Kentucky cave system was her magnum opus, a labyrinth of unrecorded passages that she believed held geological secrets dating back millennia. Her colleagues saw it as a dangerous, unstable system, but Eleanor saw only beauty and potential. She was equipped with the best gear of the era, her confidence unwavering. She told her 10-year-old son, Ethan, she was going to draw the Earth's hidden blueprints. It was the last promise she would ever make to him. The official search that followed her failure to return was strangely brief, led by the local sheriff, a man named Daniels. The search party combed the known sections of the cave for 5 days. They found her abandoned base camp near the entrance, but no sign of Eleanor herself. The consensus was quickly reached. She must have fallen into one of the deeper, unexplored fissures, a victim of the very dangers she sought to document. The operation was called off, deemed too risky for the rescue team. On October 20th, 1993, Eleanor Vance was officially declared dead, her case closed as a tragic but straightforward accident. The mountain had claimed another soul, and the official story was cemented into local history. For a young Ethan Vance, the world collapsed into a void of unanswered questions. He clutched the small brass compass his mother had given him, its needle spinning uselessly, a perfect metaphor for his own lost direction. The official report was a cold, sterile document that offered no comfort, only a hollow finality. He was told his mother was gone, lost to the deep earth. But even at 10 years old, a part of him rejected it. His mother was too meticulous, too experienced to simply fall. The story felt incomplete, a chapter torn from a book. For 18 years, he tried to build a life around that empty space, becoming an architect who designed solid, predictable structures, the very antithesis of the chaotic, mysterious cave that stole his mother. Back in 2011, Leo Miller emerged from the darkness of Stillwater Caverns, blinking against the daylight, holding a ghost in his hands. He was a scientist, a man of facts and measurements, but he knew this notebook was more than just a geological survey. It was a historical artifact, a final testament. Following protocol, he contacted the county's historical society, who, after realizing the significance of the name Eleanor Vance, alerted the local press. The news rippled through the small Kentucky community. A relic from the long-forgotten disappearance had surfaced. The story of the lost cartographer was no longer a closed case relegated to dusty archives. It was suddenly, and shockingly, active again. A message in a bottle had finally washed ashore. For nearly 2 decades, the narrative of Eleanor Vance's death had been simple and accepted. She was a brave explorer who met a tragic end. Her story served as a somber warning, a piece of Appalachian folklore about the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. But this waterlogged journal, pulled from the heart of the mountain, was a disruption. It was a voice from the grave refusing to be silenced. It promised to unravel the clean, simple story and replace it with something far more complex and disturbing. The notebook wasn't just a record of rock formations. It was a silent witness, its pages holding a truth that had been buried for 18 long years. The most critical part of the notebook was its final entry. The last page was severely damaged, but one section remained hauntingly clear. It contained a hand-drawn map of a passage not found on any existing survey of Stillwater Caverns. At the end of this crudely sketched tunnel was a large, definitive X. Beneath it, Eleanor had scrawled a few desperate words, the ink slightly blurred but the message utterly chilling. "Not a natural formation," she had written. "They're lying. Something's behind it." In that single sentence, the entire foundation of the tragic accident story crumbled. This was no longer about a fall. It was about a discovery, a lie, and a deliberate concealment. The notebook's journey was not yet over. It was about to be delivered into the hands of the one person who had been haunted by Eleanor's absence for his entire adult life. Ethan Vance, now a 28-year-old man, was about to receive the one thing he had given up all hope of ever finding, a clue. This was not just his mother's journal. It was a road map to a truth someone had gone to great lengths to bury deep within the earth. The carefully constructed piece of his life was about to be shattered. For 18 years, the cave had kept its secret. Now the last words of Eleanor Vance were about to ignite a fire that would consume the lies and expose a darkness far deeper than any cavern. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, slicing through the sterile quiet of Ethan Vance's architectural firm. He was finalizing the blueprints for a downtown high-rise, a monument to glass and steel, a testament to order and control. The world he had built for himself was one of right angles and solid foundations, a direct and conscious rebellion against the chaotic, unknowable void that had swallowed his childhood. When the receptionist buzzed his line, mentioning a call from the Kentucky County Historical Society, his focus didn't waver. It was likely a query about a historic building renovation. But then the voice on the other end, a cautious, academic tone, spoke his mother's name, Eleanor Vance. For the first time in 18 years, her name was spoken not as a memory, but as a current event. The pencil in his hand stopped moving. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, flooded his veins. His breath hitched, and the meticulously drawn lines on the blueprint blurred into an incomprehensible web. The curator on the phone spoke of a recent find in Stillwater Caverns, a field notebook preserved in oilcloth, discovered by a caver. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles were white, the plastic creaking under the pressure. He tried to form a question, but his throat was a knot of scar tissue from a wound he thought had long since healed. The world tilted on its axis, the solid floor of his high-rise office suddenly feeling as treacherous and unstable as the cave floor that had claimed his mother. He was 10 years old again, standing in a silent house, waiting for a mother who would never come home. He doesn't remember ending the call or grabbing his keys. The next thing he knew, he was in his car, navigating rush-hour traffic in a blind haze. The city, usually a symphony of predictable patterns, became a hostile, roaring chaos. Every traffic light was a personal affront, every horn a shriek in his mind. The words from the call ricocheted in his skull. Notebook. Stillwater Caverns. Your mother's handwriting. For 18 years he had accepted the official story, a sterile and simple narrative of a tragic accident. It was a flimsy shield, but it had allowed him to function, to build a life. Now, that shield was cracking, and the raw, unresolved grief of a lost child was roaring back to the surface, threatening to consume the man he had struggled so hard to become. The County Historical Society was a quiet, unassuming brick building, smelling of old paper and polished wood. It was a place for things that were finished, for stories that had ended. A kind-faced woman with graying hair led him to a small, climate-controlled viewing room. There, on a sterile metal table, lay a large, sealed evidence bag. Inside it was the notebook. It was smaller than he imagined, its leather cover warped and stained, but it was undeniably real. It was a physical object pulled from the abyss of his past, a tangible link to the ghost who haunted the edges of his life. Seeing it was like being struck by lightning. This object had been with her in the darkness. It had heard her last breaths. The sheer weight of its existence was suffocating. They wouldn't let him touch the original, citing its fragile condition. Instead, they had prepared high-resolution digital scans on a large monitor. The curator clicked the first image, and Ethan's breath caught in his chest. It was her handwriting. The elegant, precise cursive was as familiar to him as his own reflection. He remembered it from notes left on the refrigerator, from birthday cards, from corrections on his homework. It was her. Suddenly, the geological diagrams and technical notes weren't just scientific data. They were a conversation across time, a message from a woman he had only been able to remember in faded photographs. Each stroke of the pen on the page was a beat of her heart, preserved in ink and time, and it was almost too much to bear. A profound, gut-wrenching wave of sorrow washed over him, so intense it nearly buckled his knees. He had to turn away from the screen, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes to stop the sudden burn of tears. This was not the dull, chronic ache of grief he had lived with for 18 years. This was the sharp, searing pain of a fresh loss. The notebook didn't just remind him of his mother. It resurrected her. It brought back her passion, her intelligence, her very essence, only to underscore the crushing finality of her absence. The architect, the man who designed structures to withstand any force, felt his own carefully constructed emotional foundations turning to sand, the entire edifice of his adult life threatening to collapse around him. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned back to the screen, forcing himself to continue. He clicked through the pages, a digital pilgrimage through his mother's last days. He saw her meticulous maps of the cave system, each passage and chamber rendered with an artist's care and a scientist's precision. He could feel her excitement in the notes, her reverence for the ancient, silent world she was exploring. As he scrolled, the official story of a tragic accident began to feel not just incomplete, but insulting. The woman who made these notes was not careless. She was not reckless. She was a master of her craft, intimately familiar with the dangers. She wouldn't have just slipped and fallen. Something was profoundly wrong with the narrative he had been fed his entire life. Then he reached the final scanned page. It was heavily water-damaged, a ghostly image of what it once was. But a section remained horrifically clear. There was a crudely drawn map of a passage he didn't recognize from the other pages. A tunnel leading to a large, definitive X. Below it, her elegant handwriting had devolved into a desperate scrawl, the ink blurred as if by haste or fear. But the words were legible. "Not a natural formation," she had written. "They're lying. Something's behind it." The air in the room became thin and cold. The words hung there, an indictment from the grave. This wasn't a log of a geological survey. It was the last testament of a witness. Those few words detonated in the silence of the room, obliterating 18 years of accepted truth. "They're lying." The question hammered at him with physical force. Who were they? What lie was so monumental it had to be protected by sealing his mother's fate? The cold, sterile comfort of the accident report evaporated, replaced by a hot, sickening certainty. His mother hadn't been lost to the cave. She had been taken by a human act. The deep, familiar grief that had gripped him just moments ago began to curdle, transforming into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. A burning, righteous anger. The sorrow was still there, but now it had a target. It had a purpose. He looked up from the monitor, his gaze sharp and focused, meeting the concerned eyes of the curator. The quiet room, the dusty artifacts, the hushed reverence for the past, it all faded into the background. His life, which had been a study in avoiding the past, now had a singular, undeniable focus. He thought of the small brass compass she had given him, tucked away in a drawer at home, its needle spinning uselessly for years. Now it had a true north. The implicit promise he made to himself in that moment was silent, but absolute. He would follow her map. He would find the X. He would find out what was behind that wall and who had put it there. Justice, not closure, was now his destination. As Ethan walked out of the historical society and into the fading light of the afternoon, the world looked different. The solid, dependable structures of the city now seemed like facades, hiding secrets within their walls. His own life, his career built on logic and predictability, felt like a long, elaborate distraction from the one truth that mattered. The mystery of Eleanor Vance was not an empty space, not a void left by a tragic fall. It was a sealed chamber, a crime scene deliberately hidden from the world. For 18 years, a wall of rock and lies had stood between him and the truth. Now, with his mother's last words burning in his memory, he knew his life's work had just begun. He wasn't building anymore. He was going to tear it all down. To understand the storm that was about to break in 2011, we must first travel back to the deceptive calm of October 1993. Eleanor Vance was a force of nature in her own right, a brilliant geologist whose passion was not for the mountains themselves, but for the secret worlds they held within. At 35, she was a rising star in the highly specialized field of speleology, the mapping of caves. To her, Stillwater Caverns was not just another project. It was her magnum opus. Located in a remote corner of Appalachian Kentucky, the cave system was a vast, unrecorded labyrinth that she believed held geological secrets dating back millennia. While her peers saw an unstable and dangerous network of passages, Eleanor saw only breathtaking beauty and the potential for a career-defining discovery. She was driven by an insatiable, almost spiritual curiosity to chart the Earth's hidden blueprints. That drive was something her 10-year-old son Ethan understood in the way only a child can. He didn't know the scientific terms, but he knew the light in his mother's eyes when she talked about the heart of the mountain. Their bond was forged in shared wonder. She would show him fossils, explain the stories written in layers of rock, and teach him how to use the small brass compass she eventually gave him as a gift. "So you never lose your way," she had told him. Before she left for her final expedition into Stillwater, she promised him she was going to draw a map of a place no one had ever seen before. It was a promise that would become the defining ghost of his life, the last piece of solid ground he stood on before his world dissolved into a void of unanswered questions. The setting for this story, Appalachian Kentucky, was a character in itself. It was a land of stark contrasts, where breathtaking natural beauty coexisted with deep-rooted poverty and a sense of isolation. The local communities were tight-knit, bound by generations of shared history and a deep respect for the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. Stillwater Caverns was a part of that local lore, a place whispered about in stories told to children and outsiders. It was known as a place that could swallow you whole, a dangerous and unpredictable maze. This reputation kept most people away, but for Eleanor it was an irresistible invitation. The cave's very danger was a testament to its pristine, untouched state, making it the ultimate prize for a cartographer dedicated to the unknown. Operating in the background of this quiet, rural landscape was a different kind of power. Marcus Thorne was the county commissioner in 1993, a man whose ambition was as vast as the lands he oversaw. On the surface, he was a figure of progress, a charismatic businessman bringing jobs and development to a struggling region through his construction company. He spoke of modernizing the county and building a better future. Beneath that polished veneer was a cold, calculating operator with a network of influence that extended into every corner of local government. He had an uncanny ability to acquire land for consolidation projects and secure permits with little to no oversight, operating with a freedom that made many uneasy, though few dared to question him openly. The man tasked with upholding the law in this county was Sheriff Daniels. Local through and through, Daniels was a product of his environment, a man who preferred to keep the peace rather than stir up trouble. He was nearing the end of a long, unremarkable career and was more accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and public intoxication than complex criminal investigations. While not inherently corrupt, he was a man who understood the political hierarchy. He knew that figures like Marcus Thorne were best left undisturbed, their influence a current too strong to swim against. This pragmatic, almost weary approach to his duties made him vulnerable, a man who could be pressured into seeing things a certain way, especially if it meant avoiding a conflict with the county's most powerful man. In the weeks leading up to October 12, 1993, these separate worlds were on a collision course. Eleanor Vance was meticulously planning her multi-day solo expedition, packing state-of-the-art equipment and cross-referencing every known geological survey of the area. She was operating with the focused intensity of a scientist on the brink of a breakthrough. Simultaneously, but quietly, Marcus Thorne's construction company was active on a large parcel of land that conveniently sat directly above a significant portion of the Stillwater Cavern system. The official reason for the activity was ground stabilization for a future development project, a plausible excuse that allowed heavy machinery and personnel to move through the remote area without raising any alarms. The stage was being set for a tragedy hidden in plain sight. Eleanor's confidence was absolute, built on years of experience and rigorous preparation. She had dismissed the concerns of her colleagues about the cave's instability, not out of arrogance, but because her initial surveys suggested the, quote, instability was a misinterpretation of complex but predictable geological structures. She was a master of her craft, an expert in risk assessment. The idea that she would simply get lost or make a fatal, careless mistake was anathema to everything she stood for. She wasn't just exploring. She was engaged in a scientific dialogue with the Earth itself, and she believed she understood its language better than anyone. This unwavering belief in her own competence is what makes the official story of her death feel so hollow, so profoundly wrong. The final moments before her departure were etched into Ethan's memory forever. The scent of coffee in the kitchen, the weight of her climbing pack by the door, and the cool, solid feel of the brass compass in his hand. Her final words to him were not a goodbye, but a promise of return, a promise of new maps and new stories from a hidden world. She walked out the door and into the crisp autumn air, heading towards the darkness of Stillwater Caverns with a purpose that seemed almost holy. For a 10-year-old boy, his mother was an adventurer, a hero venturing into the unknown. He had no way of knowing that she was not just walking towards a geological discovery, but into a meticulously laid trap, set by a darkness far more profound than any cave. Beneath the veneer of civic progress, Marcus Thorne's operation was a creature of shadow and rust. His company, Thorne Construction, was officially engaged in, quote, ground stabilization on a vast tract of land directly over the Stillwater Caverns. Publicly, it was about preparing the unstable ground for future development, a narrative of safety and foresight. In reality, it was the perfect cover. At night, when the rest of the county slept, heavy machinery would rumble down forgotten logging roads. The crew was small, loyal, and tight-lipped, men who knew not to ask questions about the strange, carefully wrapped cargo loaded onto unmarked trucks. They weren't stabilizing ground. They were systematically plundering it, using industrial equipment to access a secret that the mountain had guarded for centuries. The noise was dismissed as routine work, the secrecy as professional discretion, a lie hidden in plain sight. In stark contrast, Eleanor Vance's mission was one of pure, unadulterated transparency. She was a scientist, and her work thrived in the light. For her expedition, She had filed her research proposal with the National Speleological Society and consulted with the Geology Department at the University of Kentucky. Her intentions were public record: to create the first complete cartographic and geological survey of stillwater caverns. This very openness, this adherence to academic protocol, made her a predictable target. Anyone with a vested interest in the secrets of that cave system would know her timeline, her intended area of exploration, and the depth of her expertise. To Marcus Thorne, her meticulous planning wasn't a sign of professionalism. It was a timetable for a threat that needed to be managed before it could expose his far more lucrative and illegal enterprise. Meanwhile, in his dusty office at the county courthouse, Sheriff Daniels was a man swimming against a current he had long ago decided was too strong to fight. His career was a monument to pragmatism, a long series of compromises made to keep the peace in a place where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. He was more of a town manager than a lawman, dealing with property disputes and minor transgressions. He knew of Marcus Thorne's influence, had seen his projects approved with suspicious speed, and understood he was a man best left to his own devices. A few weeks before Eleanor's disappearance, Thorne had casually mentioned the lady geologist who was poking around near his work site. It seemed like an innocuous comment at the time, but in hindsight, it was the first move in a carefully orchestrated chess game, placing Daniels exactly where Thorne needed him to be, compliant and incurious. The brass compass was more than a tool. It was a covenant between mother and son. Ethan remembered the day she gave it to him, the weight of it, cool and solid in his small hand. She had sat with him at the kitchen table, explaining how the magnetized needle always sought the magnetic pole, a constant, unwavering truth in a world of variables. "It's not just for finding your way in the woods, Ethan," she had said, her voice soft. "It's for finding your way in life. Always know where your true north is." For 18 years after her disappearance, that compass sat in a drawer, a painful relic of a broken promise. It was a symbol of a guidance system he had lost. He didn't realize then that it was also an inheritance, a moral instrument, waiting for the day he would need it to navigate a darkness far more treacherous than any forest. The autumn of 1993 settled over Appalachian Kentucky with a deceptive tranquility. The air grew crisp, the leaves on the rolling hills ignited in a blaze of crimson and gold, and the small towns settled into their familiar rhythms. But beneath this placid surface, unseen forces were converging on Stillwater caverns. By day, Eleanor Vance could be seen making final checks of her equipment, her focus absolute, her excitement palpable to anyone who spoke with her. By night, Thorne's trucks moved like ghosts along remote service roads, their purpose cloaked in darkness. For the residents of the county, life was unchanged. They were oblivious to the silent, high-stakes conflict about to unfold deep within the earth. It was a classic calm before a storm, a quiet moment of profound ignorance before a tragedy that would scar the community's memory. Eleanor's final journal entries, before the last desperate scrawl, pulsed with the thrill of imminent discovery. She wasn't just mapping rock, she was reading a story that was millions of years old. One entry described an unusual acoustic anomaly in a deep chamber, where a whisper would echo back as a chorus. Another noted a series of strange mineral deposits inconsistent with the surrounding limestone formations. She was a detective following a trail of geological breadcrumbs, getting closer and closer to something extraordinary. Her focus was so intensely fixed on the scientific puzzle before her that she was completely blind to the human element. She saw the cave as a pristine, natural wonder, a sanctuary for discovery, never once imagining it could also be a crime scene, a place of calculated human greed. For Marcus Thorne, Eleanor Vance was not an explorer. She was an existential threat. His secret operation was the culmination of years of planning, the discreet acquisition of the land, the carefully crafted public narrative, and the recruitment of a loyal crew. Deep within a hidden chamber of Stillwater, they had uncovered a treasure trove of priceless Paleo-Indian artifacts and burial sites. It was a discovery that would make archaeologists famous, but would make him a felon. He was systematically looting the site, selling the artifacts on a high-end black market for millions. A geologist of Eleanor's reputation wouldn't just map the cave. She would investigate every anomaly. The strange minerals, the acoustic oddities, these were the very clues that would lead her directly to his sealed-off chamber. He couldn't afford to have her find it. He couldn't afford a witness. Thus, on the morning of October 12, 1993, two parallel missions were set into motion, each unaware of the other's true nature. One was an endeavor of light, knowledge, and legacy, spearheaded by a brilliant woman armed with a compass, a notebook, and an unquenchable curiosity. The other was an operation of darkness, greed, and suppression, orchestrated by a powerful man with heavy machinery, political influence, and a chilling resolve to protect his secrets at any cost. As Eleanor Vance took her first steps into the cool, damp air of the Stillwater Caverns entrance, she believed she was entering a geological wonderland. In reality, she was walking into an ambush, a place where her quest for truth was on a direct and fatal collision course with a lie worth killing for. The mountain was not the only thing waiting for her in the dark. The raw grief that had ambushed Ethan at the Historical Society had now crystallized into something hard and sharp: purpose. As he drove away, the city's skyline, a collection of structures he had once admired for their logic and order, now seemed like an elaborate facade. Every building was a wall, every office a sealed room hiding its own secrets. His own life, so carefully constructed to avoid the chaotic pull of the past, felt like a beautifully designed lie. He arrived at his minimalist apartment and went straight to a forgotten drawer, retrieving the small brass compass his mother had given him. For 18 years, its needle had spun without direction. Now, holding the cold metal in his palm, he felt it had finally found its true north. It was pointing directly into the dark heart of a mountain in Kentucky, demanding a reckoning. His first move was one of pure logic, an architect's approach to a problem of impossible scale. He was not a caver. He understood structures and foundations, not treacherous underground passages. To enter Stillwater was to enter an alien world, and he would need a guide. There was only one person to call: Leo Miller, the man who had found the notebook. After a few calls to the Historical Society and some persistent online searching, Ethan found a number for the geologist. The ensuing phone call was tense. Ethan's voice was tight with an urgency that bordered on desperation, while Leo's was measured and cautious. He was a scientist, not a treasure hunter, but when Ethan mentioned the final page, the map to the X, a professional curiosity piqued Leo's interest. He agreed to meet, sensing this was more than just a grieving son's fantasy. They met at a roadside diner halfway between the city and the mountains, a neutral ground between Ethan's world of steel and Leo's world of stone. The scent of stale coffee and fried food hung in the air as Ethan laid his laptop on the Formica table, the high-resolution scan of Eleanor's final page illuminating their faces. Leo, a man with a weathered face and calm, intelligent eyes, leaned in, studying the desperate scrawl. He recognized the handwriting from the rest of the journal, but the map was of a place he couldn't immediately place, even with his intimate knowledge of the cave. "She was on to something," Leo said, his voice low. "Geologists, real ones like her, don't write things like, 'They're lying,' unless they've found something that fundamentally breaks the rules of nature." The unspoken question hung between them. What rule had she seen broken? Leo Miller then laid out the stark reality of their undertaking. He pulled out his own detailed survey maps of Stillwater, spreading them across the table. He pointed to a section marked with red warnings. "Based on her other entries, the X has to be somewhere in here," he explained, tapping a complex network of passages known as the Labyrinth, It's a maze, unstable, prone to flash flooding and rockfalls. We're talking about multiple days underground, advanced vertical caving skills, and a level of risk that even experienced teams avoid. He detailed the necessary equipment, a list that sounded more like a military operation than a scientific expedition, with costs easily exceeding $10,000. He wasn't trying to scare Ethan. He was giving him the facts, testing his resolve against the cold, hard science of survival. Ethan didn't flinch. The practical dangers Leo described seemed abstract compared to the concrete reality of the lie that had defined his life. "I don't care about the cost," Ethan said, his voice steady, his gaze locked on Leo's. "I'll fund everything. I'll buy the best gear. I'll sign any waiver. But I am going to that X, and I need someone who can get me there." In that moment, Leo saw past the grieving son and recognized the same unyielding determination he had read about in articles describing Eleanor Vance. It was a formidable, almost frightening force of will. He saw that Ethan wasn't asking for permission or validation. He was stating a fact. After a long, silent moment, Leo gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," he said. "We go, but we do this my way, every rule, every protocol, no exceptions." The next 2 weeks were a blur of methodical preparation, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos churning inside Ethan. His architectural firm was put on hold, his life distilled down to a single objective. He wired the funds to Leo, who began acquiring the specialized equipment, static ropes, ascenders, state-of-the-art LED headlamps, and a satellite-linked emergency beacon. They spent hours in Leo's office, a room cluttered with geological maps and rock samples, cross-referencing Eleanor's notebook with modern surveys. They attempted to pinpoint the entrance to the unmapped passage she had sketched, using topographical data to predict its likely location within the labyrinth. It was a painstaking process of logic and deduction, a scientific framework built to contain and channel the raw, burning engine of Ethan's quest for the truth. This was his mother's world, and for the first time he was learning its language. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Ethan stood in the quiet of his apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a distant galaxy. He held the brass compass, its metal warmed by his hand. He thought of his mother, not as the ghost who haunted his memories, but as the brilliant scientist on the verge of a world-changing discovery. He pictured her in the deep dark, her own light cutting through the blackness, her mind piecing together a puzzle no one else knew existed. The compass was no longer a symbol of what he had lost. It was a symbol of what he was about to reclaim. It was a moral instrument, a piece of his mother's soul, and its needle pointed unwaveringly toward the fight ahead. He felt a calm settle over him, the cold, clear focus of a man walking toward his destiny. On the morning of March 28, 2011, they stood at the gaping maw of Stillwater Caverns. A cool, ancient breath flowed from the entrance, carrying the scent of wet limestone and deep earth. It was a threshold between worlds. For Leo, it was a familiar, respected adversary. For Ethan, it was a tomb, a crime scene, and the only path forward. They performed a final gear check, the clicks and snaps of carabiners echoing in the morning quiet. Leo's instructions were crisp and professional, grounding the moment in procedure. But as they switched on their headlamps, casting 2 bright cones of light into the waiting darkness, the true nature of their mission was undeniable. They were not just explorers retracing a map. They were investigators seeking evidence, and the cave itself was the only witness. The journey downward was a descent into another reality, a world governed by cold, pressure, and an all-consuming silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic drip of water, the crunch of their boots on loose rock, and the metallic clink of their gear. Leo moved with a practiced, almost silent grace, his headlamp beam sweeping methodically across the path ahead. Ethan followed, his movements stiffer, his every sense on high alert. The air was heavy and thick, with the smell of wet earth and ancient stone, a scent he imagined was the last thing his mother ever breathed. In his pocket, the brass compass was a cold, solid weight, a physical anchor to his purpose. He wasn't just following a map, he was walking back through time into the final, terrifying moments of his mother's life, and the darkness felt alive, watching. After 2 hours of steady progress, they reached the section Leo had identified from Eleanor's notes, the labyrinth. The name was an understatement. It was a chaotic, three-dimensional maze of narrow passages, tight squeezes, and confusing forks that seemed designed to disorient and trap. Here, the risk became palpable. Leo's calm professionalism was their only guide as he consulted his own detailed surveys, cross-referencing them with the scans of Eleanor's notebook. She was incredibly accurate, Leo murmured, his voice absorbed by the stone walls. Her triangulation points are almost perfect. For Ethan, an architect who imposed order on the world, this natural chaos was an affront. He tried to see the patterns, the structural logic, but there was none. It was a world built without rules, a perfect place to hide a secret forever. They paused in a small, slightly wider chamber to rest and rehydrate. The oppressive silence was broken only by their own breathing. Ethan pulled out his tablet, the screen's glow eerily bright in the absolute darkness, and brought up the scan of his mother's journal. He found an entry corresponding to this very section of the cave. Her handwriting was filled with scientific wonder, describing the unique calcite formations as, quote, stone lilies blooming in the dark. He could feel her passion, her pure academic joy. She wasn't afraid down here. She was home. That connection, that shared moment in the same space 18 years apart, made the final, desperate entry all the more horrifying. The woman who wrote about stone lilies was not someone who made a careless mistake. She was a witness who saw something that twisted her wonder into fear. It was Leo who saw the first inconsistency. As they prepared to move on, his headlamp froze on a section of the far wall. "Hold on," he said, his voice sharp with professional curiosity. He moved closer, running a gloved hand over the surface. "Look at the sediment stratification here," he pointed. "It's too uniform. See how the layers are perfectly horizontal? In a dynamic system like this, you'd expect more variation, more chaos from water flow and mineral deposits." To Ethan's untrained eye, it just looked like a damp rock wall. But to Leo, it was a geological lie. It was a small detail, a subtle break in the natural pattern, but in the world of scientific observation, it was a screaming anomaly. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to cover their tracks. They followed the wall of anomalous sediment for another 50 yards, the passage narrowing until it ended in a small circular chamber. It was a dead end. But as Leo checked his instruments, a quiet intensity came over him. He cross-referenced his GPS location with Eleanor's final map. The laser distance meter confirmed the chamber's dimensions. A cold certainty settled in the air. "We're here," Leo stated, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "This is the X, my." There was no mark on the wall, no physical sign. There was only the chilling realization that they were standing in the exact spot where Eleanor Vance's meticulous survey had abruptly and violently concluded. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. The air in the chamber felt heavy, stagnant, as if it hadn't moved in 18 years. This was the end of the map. Ethan stepped forward, a primal instinct taking over. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the rock face of the dead end. It was cold, but a different kind of cold. Duller, less alive than the surrounding limestone. He ran his fingers over the surface, feeling for the familiar, rough texture of the cave. Instead, his fingertips brushed against a surface that was subtly, unnervingly smooth beneath a thin layer of applied grime. He pulled a small multi-tool from his belt and, with a trembling hand, scraped at a low, inconspicuous section of the wall. A small flake of dark sediment came away, revealing not the pale, crystalline structure of limestone, but a dull, gray, granular material. The sound of metal on concrete echoed in the absolute silence. It was a small, quiet scrape, but it shattered a lie that had stood for nearly 2 decades. The sight of the concrete, stark and artificial against the natural cave, hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The abstract theory of a cover-up had suddenly become a tangible, horrifying reality. This wasn't a cave wall. It was a man-made barrier. A plug. A tombstone. His mother's words, asterisk, not a natural formation. They're lying. Asterisk, blasted through his mind, no longer a frantic scrawl but a confirmed, echoing truth. The deep, familiar sorrow he had carried for so long was instantly burned away by a clean, white-hot rage. He wasn't looking at a geological feature. He was looking at the seal of a crime scene, a deliberate act of concealment. His mother hadn't been lost. She had been entombed. And he was standing right in front of her grave. Leo, usually a man of calm scientific detachment, stared at the exposed concrete, momentarily speechless. The implications were staggering. To haul bags of cement, sand, water, and tools this deep into the labyrinth required a coordinated, well-equipped team. To then camouflage it with such care to mimic natural sediment patterns was an act of meticulous, cold-blooded deception. After a moment, his training kicked in. He began taking photographs, meticulously documenting the location and collecting samples of both the concrete and the artificial sediment. The mission had changed instantly. They were no longer just retracing Eleanor's steps. They were now standing before a sealed vault, and the question that screamed in the silence was no longer what had happened to her, but what lay behind that wall that was worth killing for. The retreat from the cave was a silent, grim procession. Gone was the academic curiosity or the son's desperate hope. In its place was the cold, heavy certainty of a crime. Ethan and Leo moved with a grim purpose, the rhythmic clinking of their gear, the only sound in the oppressive darkness. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every drip of water a whisper of the truth they now carried. The concrete wall was more than just evidence. It was a gravestone, a monument to a meticulously crafted lie. They were no longer just retracing Eleanor Vance's final steps. They were now the custodians of a truth that had been buried for 18 years, and the weight of that knowledge was both a terrifying burden and a powerful, galvanizing force. The beautiful, chaotic world of Stillwater Caverns had transformed into a crime scene, and they were the only living witnesses. Back on the surface, under the vast, indifferent sky, the ordinary world felt like a flimsy facade. Ethan's first action was driven by cold, calculated logic. He contacted Dr. Evelyn Reed, a forensic geologist Leo knew and trusted implicitly. With trembling hands, he uploaded the high-resolution photos of the wall and the data from their laser measurements. Over the phone, he described the scene with the detached precision of an architect detailing a structural flaw, deliberately separating his raw emotion from the hard facts. Dr. Reed's initial reaction was one of professional disbelief, which quickly sharpened into focused intrigue. Her preliminary assessment was chilling. The material was undeniably man-made, and the sediment covering it was a sophisticated, deliberately applied camouflage. The lie wasn't just told, it was meticulously engineered, revealing a level of planning that was both brilliant and monstrous. A few days later, a call came to the untraceable burner phone Ethan had started using. The voice on the other end was frail, raspy, and thick, with a guilt that had clearly festered for nearly 2 decades. The man didn't give his name, only identifying himself as someone who was, quote, part of the search in '93. It was the retired Sheriff Daniels. He explained that he'd seen a small local news report about the discovery of Eleanor's notebook and knew, with a sinking finality, that this day would eventually come. He sounded terrified but also strangely relieved, as if the suffocating weight of his silence had finally become a burden too heavy to carry alone. He agreed to meet Ethan, but only on his strict terms: a remote, public location, no recordings, and no one else present. The abstract conspiracy suddenly had a human voice. They met on a desolate fishing pier, the gray, overcast sky bleeding into the murky water below. The former Sheriff Daniels was a stooped figure, his face a roadmap of regret. He stared out at the water as he spoke, confessing that the official search for Eleanor in 1993 had been a sham. It was strangely brief, suspiciously superficial. He and his deputies had been prepared to mount a deep search into the labyrinth, the most dangerous and logical place to look, but the order had come down to stop. It wasn't a recommendation or a suggestion based on risk assessment. It was a direct, non-negotiable command from a higher authority. He was instructed to call off the entire operation, officially declare Eleanor Vance the victim of a tragic accident, and close the file for good. The official story was a complete fabrication, a narrative he was forced to create and uphold. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He kept his voice low, but it was edged with a cold, hard fury. "Who gave the order?" he pressed. Daniels finally turned to look at him, his eyes swimming with a mixture of fear and profound shame. "It came from the county commissioner's office," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. "From Marcus Thorne. He claimed the area was too unstable, that I'd be risking my men's lives for a woman who was already gone. He framed it as a compassionate, responsible decision, but it felt wrong. It felt like he wasn't protecting us. He was protecting something inside that cave." The name landed with the force of a physical blow, giving Ethan's quest for justice a solid, terrifying target. Marcus Thorne, a man now celebrated as a local hero. The confession shattered the case wide open. The conspiracy was no longer a faceless entity. It had a name, a position of power, and a motive shrouded in darkness. Ethan now possessed a direct link between the concrete wall buried deep in the earth and the influential man who had orchestrated the official cover-up. He returned to his apartment, the name Marcus Thorne, a toxic echo in the quiet rooms. His investigation pivoted from geology to history, from the secrets of the earth to the secrets of men. He plunged into the county's public records archives, a world of dusty ledgers and brittle microfilm, meticulously sifting through property deeds, zoning applications, and construction permits from 1993. He was searching for a single, undeniable thread in a tapestry of lies that had been woven nearly 2 decades earlier. He found it. In the months leading up to his mother's disappearance, a company named Thorne Construction had quietly acquired a massive parcel of land that sat directly over a significant portion of the Stillwater Caverns system. The purchase was obscured within a larger, innocuous land consolidation deal. Then, just weeks before Eleanor began her expedition, Thorne's company was granted a series of unusual, fast-tracked permits for ground stabilization and geological surveying. It was the perfect, ironclad alibi. Any unusual activity, any heavy machinery rumbling down remote logging roads, any restricted access to the area, could be explained away as part of this legitimate, publicly sanctioned project. Thorne hadn't just reacted to his mother's discovery. He had meticulously laid the groundwork for the crime and its concealment long before she ever set foot in that cave. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Thorne knew his mother was going into that cave. Daniel's confession proved he was aware of the quote, lady geologist. He had secured the land, created the perfect corporate cover story with his construction company, and then wielded his political power to control the law enforcement response. The concrete wall was not a panicked, haphazard reaction. It was a calculated, premeditated part of the plan. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he grasped the true scale of the conspiracy. This wasn't a singular act of violence. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation involving strategic land acquisition, political manipulation, and a construction crew sworn to absolute secrecy. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. He wasn't just fighting one man. He was fighting a deeply entrenched legacy of corruption. Armed with his new arsenal of evidence, Ethan and Leo met again with Dr. Reed, who had completed her full forensic analysis of the samples from the cave. Her findings were the scientific nail in the coffin. The concrete mix, she explained, contained specific commercial aggregates not native to the region, proving the materials were brought in from an industrial supplier. More damningly, the artificial sediment used for camouflage contained microscopic trace amounts of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid, consistent with the use of heavy construction machinery. "This wall wasn't built with shovels and buckets," she stated, her voice grim and resolute. "This was built by a professional crew with serious equipment. Someone went to an incredible amount of trouble and expense to make sure this secret remained permanent." Her report transformed their theory into irrefutable fact. The weight of the truth was now immense, but the path forward was more dangerous than ever. Marcus Thorne was no longer a mere county commissioner from the past. He had spent the last 2 decades cultivating an image as a beloved philanthropist, a pillar of the community with deep pockets, and a web of influence that reached into every corner of the state. A direct accusation from Ethan would be easily dismissed as the wild, unsubstantiated fantasy of a grieving son. They had proof of a wall, proof of a cover-up, and proof of Thorne's involvement in that cover-up. But they still lacked the most critical piece of the puzzle, the motive. What was behind that wall that was so valuable, so incriminating, that it was worth murdering a brilliant scientist and orchestrating a decades-long conspiracy to hide? The conflict had now escalated from a personal quest for closure into a high-stakes battle against a powerful and ruthless adversary. Ethan understood that he could no longer operate in the shadows. He had to force the issue, to drag the crime out of the darkness of the cave and into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The next step was the most perilous of all, obtaining the legal authority to bring down that wall. It would mean convincing a judge to issue a warrant based on the testimony of a guilt-ridden ex-sheriff and the forensic evidence of a hidden concrete barrier. It was an audacious long shot, and one that would immediately alert Marcus Thorne that the secret he had buried 18 years ago was about to be violently unearthed. The moment they filed that request, the Cold War would turn hot. The decision to seek a warrant was a declaration of war, and Ethan knew it. This was no longer a personal quest conducted in the shadows. It was a formal public challenge to a man who had spent 2 decades burying a murder under layers of influence and philanthropy. He couldn't just walk into a courthouse with a wild story. He needed a legal gladiator, someone unafraid to confront the local power structure. The moment they filed that petition, every resource Marcus Thorne commanded would be mobilized against them. It was a terrifying gamble. A failed attempt would not only see him publicly discredited and branded a delusional fanatic, but it could also expose him to a far more direct and physical form of retaliation from an enemy with everything to lose. The system wasn't just a neutral arbiter. It was a machine Thorne had helped build. Ethan found his champion in Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, tenacious lawyer whose small-town office belied a fierce reputation for taking on cases others deemed unwinnable. Initially, her skepticism was palpable. She listened with a practiced, impassive expression as Ethan laid out the story, a narrative that sounded like a fever dream. A dead mother, a lost notebook, a concrete wall in a cave, and a whispered confession from a guilt-ridden ex-sheriff. But then Ethan presented the evidence. He showed her the high-resolution photos of the wall, played the audio of Leo Miller's expert analysis, and handed her Dr. Reed's preliminary forensic report. As she absorbed the cold, hard facts, her demeanor shifted from detached professionalism to a focused, predatory intensity. She saw the truth in the details, a story of profound evil that was not only believable but provable. Sarah laid out the brutal legal reality. "We're petitioning a judge for an excavation warrant," she explained, her voice sharp and clear. "It's an extraordinary measure. We are asking the court to authorize the destruction of what Thorne's attorneys will call a natural rock formation within a protected geological site, all based on an 18-year-old cold case." She paced her small office, the floorboards creaking. "Thorne's legal team will be a pack of wolves. They'll paint you as an unstable, grieving son lost in a conspiracy fantasy. They'll try to get Daniel's testimony thrown out as the ramblings of a senile old man. Our evidence has to be so airtight, so undeniable, that any judge who rules against us will look either incompetent or corrupt. We get one shot at this. We can't afford to miss." As they began compiling the legal petition, the conspiracy's modern-day presence made itself known. A dark, nondescript sedan began appearing on the street outside Ethan's apartment, its occupants making no effort to hide their surveillance. His phone calls were punctuated by strange clicks and echoes. It was a classic, low-level intimidation campaign, a silent message from Thorne's network. "We see you." The threat was no longer an abstract concept tied to the past. It was a palpable, present-day danger. This wasn't just about protecting a historical crime. The network that enabled Thorne to commit murder in 1993 was still active, still loyal, and still willing to enforce his will with the chilling promise of violence. The fight wasn't against a ghost. It was against a living, breathing monster with eyes everywhere. A new piece of the historical puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. Leo Miller, unable to let the geological inconsistencies go, had been digging through the state's dusty mining archives. He unearthed a series of obscure geological surveys from the 1920s, long before Thorne's time. These old documents, dismissed as unreliable at the time, made repeated, cryptic references to a chamber within the Stillwater system containing unusual crystalline structures and pigmented rock, precisely what Eleanor had noted as mineral anomalies. This discovery was monumental. It suggested the secret of the cave, the treasure Thorne was plundering, was known to a select few for generations. Thorne hadn't just stumbled upon it. He had likely acted on old information, a hidden legacy of greed that stretched back decades before his own crime. The conspiracy was older and deeper than Ethan ever imagined. Realizing that Thorne's first move would be to control the narrative, Sarah Jenkins decided to launch a preemptive strike. She contacted a trusted investigative journalist, a Pulitzer finalist known for his tenacity in exposing corruption in Appalachia. She provided him with a carefully curated package of information: the story of the notebook, the existence of the concrete wall, and the fact that the original investigation was mysteriously cut short. She withheld the direct link to Thorne and Daniels' name, creating a tantalizing mystery that was both publicly compelling and legally defensible. The resulting article, published online, went viral in the region. The headline was a bombshell. Lost geologist's son claims 1993 cave death was a cover-up, cites new evidence of sealed chamber. For the first time, Marcus Thorne was on the defensive. Thorne's response was a masterclass in public relations warfare. He immediately called a press conference, standing before the cameras not as a cornered suspect, but as a wounded community patriarch. He spoke with a calm, sorrowful gravitas about the tragic loss of Eleanor Vance, a brilliant mind taken too soon. He expressed deep sympathy for Ethan, portraying him as a troubled young man understandably haunted by his past, who was being exploited by sensationalists. He masterfully twisted the narrative, framing Ethan's quest for justice as a painful, misguided attack on the community's healing. He looked directly into the camera, his expression one of pained sincerity, and offered Ethan his prayers. It was a chilling, brilliant performance that swayed public opinion and painted Ethan as the villain in his own story. The public pressure campaign had its intended effect. The day after Thorne's press conference, a sleek black car pulled into retired Sheriff Daniels' quiet driveway. A man in an expensive suit, a lawyer from one of Thorne's many holding companies, got out. He didn't threaten Daniels. He was polite, even friendly. He spoke of Daniels' long service to the community, his peaceful retirement, and the unfortunate legal complexities and public scrutiny that came with testifying in such a high-profile, emotionally charged case. He mentioned how stressful a court appearance could be for a man his age. The message was delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in a velvet glove of concern, but the iron fist of intimidation was unmistakable. Daniels called Ethan later that day, his voice trembling. He was scared. The conspiracy's arms were long, and they were tightening around him. The weight of it all began to crush Ethan. He saw the fear he was causing in Daniels, a man who had already lived with guilt for 2 decades. He read the online comments branding him a delusional ghoul, disrespecting his mother's memory for attention. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, he questioned everything. Not the truth, but his right to pursue it at such a cost. Was he honoring his mother, or was he just creating more victims, destroying the fragile peace of others to soothe his own pain? Alone in his apartment, he took out the brass compass. He held the cold metal in his hand, its needle quivering slightly before settling, pointing north. It was a silent, powerful reminder from his mother. Find your way. Find the truth. The momentary doubt was burned away by a renewed, hardened resolve. The final, undeniable piece of evidence came from Dr. Evelyn Reed. Working relentlessly in her lab, she had performed a spectrographic analysis on the concrete sample. She discovered that the specific chemical composition of the aggregate mix was unique to a single supplier in the region. Cross-referencing this with commercial records from 1993, she found a massive, off-the-books purchase of that exact concrete mix. The buyer was a shell corporation named Appalachian Groundworks, LLC. It took Sarah Jenkins less than a day to cut through the corporate veil. Appalachian Groundworks was registered to a holding company, which was, in turn, a wholly owned subsidiary of Thorne Construction. The scientific evidence was now an unbreakable financial chain, a paper trail leading directly from the tomb in the cave to Marcus Thorne's front door. With the irrefutable financial link, a terrified but resolute Sheriff Daniels ready to testify, and the court of public opinion now buzzing with suspicion, Sarah Jenkins filed the motion. The document landed on the county clerk's desk with the force of an earthquake. The conflict had moved from the shadows of the cave to the fluorescent lights of the justice system. A hearing was set. Marcus Thorne, the untouchable philanthropist and community icon, was officially served with a summons. He was being legally compelled to appear in court and argue why a judge should not authorize a team to demolish a concrete wall that, for 18 years, he had pretended did not exist. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the battle for the truth of Stillwater Caverns was about to begin. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with whispered speculation and the cold, sterile weight of the law. Marcus Thorne, a monument of tailored suits and feigned indignation, sat opposite them, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. But Sarah Jenkins had been relentless. She presented Dr. Reed's forensic report, a chain of evidence linking Thorne's shell company directly to the concrete used in the wall. She put the terrified but resolute former Sheriff Daniels on the stand, whose testimony about Thorne's direct order to halt the 1993 search sent a shockwave through the room. Against all odds, the judge, a woman known for her unassailable integrity, granted the warrant. The order was signed. They were going to bring down the wall. The news exploded, and a small army of media descended on the remote entrance to Stillwater Caverns. The return to the cave was a surreal procession. This time, there were not two men sneaking into the darkness, but a small official team moving with the full authority of the state. The entrance was cordoned off with yellow tape, generators hummed, and the distant flashes of news cameras strobed against the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of the drama. Ethan felt a strange detachment, as if watching a movie of his own life. He walked alongside Leo and Sarah, followed by a court-appointed forensic team and two grim-faced demolition experts. The air flowing from the cave's mouth was just as cold and ancient, but today it felt different. It felt like a held breath, a silence on the verge of being broken by a final, terrible scream. The entire world was watching them descend into his family's tomb. When they reached the X, the chamber was transformed. Powerful battery-operated floodlights banished the natural darkness, casting the concrete wall in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Under the bright, sterile light, the artificial sediment camouflage looked pathetic and grotesque, a cheap theatrical trick. The space felt smaller, more claustrophobic, charged with an almost unbearable tension. One of the demolition experts, a burly, silent man with methodical hands, ran a gloved finger over the surface, his eyes scanning for structural weaknesses. He exchanged a quiet, technical murmur with his partner, their voices absorbed by the stone. Ethan's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, each beat echoing the long, 18-year wait. He stood beside Sarah, his hands clenched so tight his fingernails dug into his palms, bracing for the inevitable violence to come. The first sound was a high-pitched, piercing whine that shattered the cave's primordial silence. The demolition expert pressed a diamond-tipped core drill against the center of the wall, the sound grating and unnatural in the enclosed space. It was a violation, an industrial scream tearing through a place of quiet, geological time. Rock dust filled the air with a chalky scent. Ethan watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the drill bit into the concrete, the very substance that had served as his mother's headstone for nearly 2 decades. The noise was more than a sound. It was the physical manifestation of his own rage, a focused, mechanical fury aimed at the heart of the lie. Every revolution of the drill was a second of stolen time, a moment of truth being violently reclaimed from the darkness that had held it captive. Then, with a final, grinding push, the drill bit broke through the other side. A sudden, sharp hiss echoed through the chamber as air, trapped for 18 years, rushed out to meet them. It was a ghostly exhalation, the breath of a sealed tomb. The air that escaped was cold and carried a faint, musty odor, the smell of stagnant time, dry decay, and something else, something uniquely mineral. Ethan recoiled, a purely visceral reaction. That was the air his mother had breathed in her final moments. It was the scent of her prison, and inhaling it felt like swallowing a shard of glass. The scientific mission, the legal procedure, it all melted away, leaving only the raw human horror of the moment. He was breathing the air from his mother's grave. The demolition began in earnest. The experts inserted a hydraulic splitter, a powerful tool known as a rock cracker, into the hole. With a low, deep groan of straining metal, the machine came to life. There was no explosion, only a series of immense, percussive cracks that reverberated through the very stone beneath their feet. Large, jagged chunks of concrete groaned, split, and then fell to the cave floor with heavy, deafening thuds. Rebar, the rusted steel skeleton of the wall, was exposed, twisted, and grotesque. The process was brutally slow and methodical, a controlled demolition of the barrier that had enforced Thorne's secret. With each section that fell, Ethan felt a corresponding piece of the suffocating weight on his own chest crumble away. They were not just breaking concrete, they were dismantling a lie, piece by painful piece. After 20 minutes of relentless, bone-jarring work, a large section of the upper wall finally gave way, collapsing inward with a final echoing crash. A dark, black rectangle now gaped in the center of the wall, a doorway into absolute blackness. The demolition team powered down the splitter, and a profound, ringing silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the sound of their own heavy breathing. Everyone froze, their headlamps fixed on the void. It was a portal, a wound in the rock leading to the heart of the mystery. The stale air from within flowed more freely now, thicker and more cloying. The question that had driven Ethan for months hung, unspoken, in the sudden quiet. What was on the other side? What truth had this wall been built to contain? Leo, ever the cautious scientist, was the first to move. He uncoiled a long, flexible fiber-optic camera, its lens no bigger than a pencil eraser, and carefully fed it through the opening. A forensic officer held a small, high-resolution monitor, its screen illuminating their tense faces. The first images were a chaotic blur of dust and darkness. Then, as Leo navigated the camera, the view stabilized, panning across a vast, open space. The chamber behind the wall was immense, far larger than any of them had anticipated. It was a hidden world, perfectly preserved. The camera continued to pan slowly, its light cutting a swath through the black, revealing the contours of a massive, cathedral-like cavern that had been erased from all known maps of Stillwater. Suddenly, the camera's light fell upon a wall, and a collective gasp went through the small group huddled around the monitor. The grainy image resolved into a breathtaking sight. The wall was not bare rock. It was a canvas covered in magnificent, intricate paintings. Stylized figures of bison, deer, and human hunters, rendered in deep red and black ochre, danced across the stone. The style was ancient, powerful, and unlike any previously documented Paleo-Indian art found in North America, it was a pristine, untouched gallery from a lost world, a discovery that would rewrite history books. The motive for murder was suddenly, shockingly clear. This wasn't just a treasure. It was a priceless, irreplaceable piece of human heritage, and Marcus Thorne had tried to steal it for himself. "My God," Sarah Jenkins whispered, her lawyerly composure momentarily shattered by the raw historical power of the image on the screen. "A find of this magnitude. It belongs to the world, to a museum." He wasn't just hiding a crime. He was hiding this. The sheer, breathtaking greed of it all settled upon them. Thorne hadn't just killed a woman who stumbled upon his secret. He had attempted to privatize a legacy that belonged to humanity, to break off a piece of our collective past and sell it to the highest bidder on the black market. The concrete wall was not just a tombstone for Eleanor Vance. It was the vault door to a stolen chapter of human history, and the scale of his depravity was far greater than any of them had ever dared to imagine. The demolition crew worked with renewed urgency, widening the opening until it was large enough for a person to safely pass through. A forensic officer in a clean suit went first, establishing a sterile path. Leo followed, his scientific curiosity now mixed with a deep sense of awe. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood at the threshold, the air from the two chambers mixing around him. One familiar and alive, the other stagnant and dead. He took a deep, shuddering breath and squeezed through the jagged opening. He was no longer in Stillwater Caverns. He had stepped through a tear in time, into the silent, sacred space where his mother's life had ended. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. The team passed the powerful floodlights through the opening, and the hidden chamber was bathed in brilliant clinical light. It was a natural wonder, a geological cathedral adorned with the ghosts of ancient artists. For a moment, Ethan was lost in the majesty of it, the same majesty that must have captivated his mother. But his eyes were not looking for art. His gaze swept the dusty floor, frantically searching. Then, in the far corner of the vast chamber, away from the magnificent painted walls, the beam of his headlamp caught something. A flash of faded red fabric, a caver's pack, half buried in dust. Next to it, a small, still shape huddled against the base of the wall. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The world dissolved, narrowing to that single heartbreaking tableau. He walked forward slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the undisturbed dust of nearly 2 decades. The forensic team stayed back, giving him space. He didn't need their confirmation. A son knows. There, nestled in the fine gray powder of time, lay the skeletal remains of a human being. Her form was curled slightly, as if she had simply sat down to rest and never gotten up. Beside her, where it had fallen from her hand, was a geologist's rock hammer, the final, damning proof. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been here, at work, in the middle of the greatest discovery of her life, when she was silenced. Ethan sank to his knees in the dust, the sounds of his own ragged breathing, the only noise in the vast, silent chamber. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small brass compass. Its needle quivered, then settled, pointing north. He was home, and after 18 years, so was she. The silence that followed the discovery was profound, a sacred hush that fell over the team as they stood on the threshold of a forgotten world. The forensic officers moved with a quiet, reverential purpose, their sterile procedures, a stark contrast to the raw, ancient power of the chamber. Ethan remained on his knees in the dust, the cold brass of the compass, a solid anchor in the swirling vortex of his emotions. For 18 years his mother had been a ghost, a question mark, a void. Now she was a physical reality, a tragic tableau of bones and faded fabric. The roar of grief and anger that had fueled him for so long subsided, replaced by a vast, aching sorrow. He wasn't an investigator anymore. He was just a son, finally reunited with his mother in the quiet darkness of her tomb. The official report from the state medical examiner was clinical and devastating, yet it was the validation Ethan had fought so hard to secure. The analysis of the remains confirmed they were, without a doubt, those of Eleanor Vance. More critically, the forensic anthropologist identified multiple fractures on the skull, consistent with repeated blows from a heavy, focused object. The pattern of the impacts perfectly matched the peen of the geologist's rock hammer found beside her body. The cause of death was no longer a mystery or a tragic accident. It was officially ruled a homicide by blunt force trauma. The case file, dusty and closed for nearly 2 decades, was now the center of an active, high-profile murder investigation, with Marcus Thorne as the sole and primary suspect. The arrest was executed not in the dead of night, but in the bright light of day, a deliberate act of public reckoning. Marcus Thorne was leaving a charity luncheon at the most exclusive country club in the county when 2 state police cruisers, sirens silent, boxed in his luxury sedan. The press, tipped off by an anonymous source, captured every moment. The man who had cultivated an image of untouchable philanthropy stood stunned as officers approached, the warrant held up for him to see. His mask of calm, patrician authority shattered, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The philanthropist was gone, and in his place stood a common murderer, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him in a blaze of camera flashes. The fall of Marcus Thorne created a domino effect, toppling the network of silence he had built around himself. Faced with conspiracy and accessory to murder charges, the men who had formed his construction crew in 1993 saw their loyalty evaporate. One by one, they confessed, their stories painting a chillingly detailed picture of the crime. They described being paid exorbitant sums in cash for a, quote, special project, hauling bags of concrete and equipment deep into still water caverns under the cover of night. They admitted to building the wall under Thorne's direct supervision just hours after they watched him confront and then brutally murder Eleanor Vance. The conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was a documented operation, laid bare by the sworn testimony of its own terrified participants. With Thorne's network crumbling, the full scope of his motive was laid bare for the world to see. Archaeological experts, summoned from the Smithsonian and leading universities, descended upon the newly discovered Vance chamber. Their assessment was unanimous and earth-shattering. The cave paintings and artifacts constituted one of the most significant Paleo-Indian sites ever found in North America, a priceless window into a lost civilization. Financial investigators, meanwhile, unraveled Thorne's complex web of shell corporations, tracing a clear path of looted artifacts sold for tens of millions of dollars on the international black market. Thorne wasn't just a killer, he was a plunderer of history, a man willing to commit murder to privatize a legacy that belonged to all of humanity. The final, horrifying moments of Eleanor Vance's life were pieced together from the evidence and confessions. She had stumbled into the chamber, not with fear, but with the pure, unadulterated joy of a scientist making the discovery of a lifetime. She was likely sketching the paintings, documenting her find in her notebook, when Thorne and his men arrived to continue their looting. He would have tried to buy her silence, then threaten her. But Eleanor, a woman of unshakable integrity, would have refused. Realizing she was a witness who could not be controlled, Thorne made a cold, calculated decision. He grabbed the rock hammer from her belt, the very tool of her trade, and used it to silence her forever, sealing her and her monumental discovery behind a wall of concrete and lies. Former Sheriff Daniels, no longer a shadowy figure on a pier, became the prosecution's star witness. Granted immunity for his full cooperation, he took the stand and, in a voice heavy with the guilt of 2 decades, recounted the direct order from then-Commissioner Thorne to abort the search and officially declare Eleanor Vance the victim of an accident. He described the pressure, the veiled threats to his career, and the suffocating burden of the secret he was forced to keep. His testimony was the critical link, connecting the powerful public figure to the direct, illegal manipulation of a murder investigation. In the courtroom, his confession was not an act of cowardice, but one of profound, painful courage, a final, desperate grasp at a redemption he knew he could never fully earn. The trial of Marcus Thorne was a media spectacle, a modern-day morality play that captivated the nation. Sarah Jenkins, in a masterful display of legal strategy, systematically dismantled Thorne's defense. She presented an avalanche of irrefutable evidence: Dr. Reed's forensic analysis of the concrete, the financial records linking Thorne's company to the materials, the chilling confessions of his former employees, and the heartbreaking testimony of the ex-sheriff. She concluded with the most powerful evidence of all: the high-resolution photographs of the Vance chamber and the skeletal remains of the woman who had discovered it. Thorne's expensive legal team could offer no credible defense, their arguments dissolving into empty rhetoric against the mountain of meticulously assembled truth. The jury's deliberation was brief. Marcus Thorne was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and dozens of federal charges related to the theft and trafficking of priceless cultural artifacts. The judge, citing the unfathomable greed and cold-blooded cruelty of the crime, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Thorne was led from the courtroom, stripped of his power and prestige, the community he had so long deceived was forced into a painful reckoning. Their greatest benefactor was, in fact, their most monstrous villain, his legacy of charity forever tainted by the shadow of the cave and the murder he committed to protect his greed. In the aftermath, the narrative surrounding Eleanor Vance was irrevocably transformed. She was no longer a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered among cavers. She was celebrated as a scientific martyr, a hero of exploration, who made a world-changing discovery and paid for it with her life. The National Speleological Society and several universities posthumously awarded her their highest honors. In a formal ceremony attended by scientists and dignitaries from around the world, the hidden cavern in Stillwater was officially named the Vance Chamber. Her legacy was no longer one of tragedy and mystery, but of courage, integrity, and a discovery that had forever enriched our understanding of the human story. Her name was finally etched in stone, not as a victim, but as a pioneer. For Ethan, the resolution was not a moment of triumphant victory, but one of quiet, profound peace. He had pursued justice with a relentless fury, but its achievement left him with a sense of solemn stillness. He arranged a proper funeral for his mother, a service attended by friends, family, and colleagues who had not seen her in nearly 2 decades. Afterward, he stood alone at her new gravesite, the simple granite headstone bearing her name and the words, "Explorer, Scientist, Mother." He reached into his pocket and placed the small brass compass on the cool stone, its needle pointing north. The journey his mother had started, the journey he was forced to finish, was finally over. He had navigated the darkness and brought her home. The impact of the discovery rippled through the small Appalachian community, transforming it in ways no one could have predicted. The Vance Chamber became a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a state-of-the-art research facility and museum were built nearby, dedicated to the study of the Paleo-Indian art and the life of Eleanor Vance. The influx of tourism, research grants, and global attention brought a new kind of prosperity to the once isolated region. In a twist of profound irony, the truth that Marcus Thorne had killed to suppress ultimately brought more legitimate and lasting value to his community than his decades of corrupt philanthropy ever could. It was a legacy born not of greed, but of one woman's courageous pursuit of knowledge. In the end, the story of Stillwater Caverns became a powerful testament to the enduring nature of truth. It proved that a lie, no matter how meticulously constructed or fiercely protected, cannot withstand the relentless pressure of a single, determined voice seeking justice. The darkness that claimed Eleanor Vance was not the primordial blackness of the cave, but the far more terrifying void of human greed. Her son's quest, guided by the memory of her passion and the unwavering needle of a simple brass compass, demonstrated that even after years of silence, the truth can be unearthed. It can be brought, blinking, into the light, where it can finally heal the wounds of the past and redraw the maps of the future. A year after Marcus Thorne's conviction, Ethan Vance stood once more at the mouth of Stillwater Caverns. The yellow police tape was long gone, replaced by a tasteful, permanent sign designating it a protected heritage site. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone, flowed from the entrance. It was no longer the cold breath of a tomb, but a quiet whisper of history. He didn't feel the burning rage or the suffocating grief that had once driven him here. Instead, there was a profound stillness, a sense of a debt finally paid. In his mind, he saw his mother not as a victim in the dark, but as a pioneer bathed in the light of her discovery, her legacy now as solid and enduring as the mountain itself. The war was over, and peace, a concept he had long forgotten, had finally settled in his soul. The town itself had been reborn. The dark money from Thorne's philanthropy, which had always felt like a gilded cage, was replaced by a wave of legitimate prosperity. The new Vance Museum and Research Institute, built near the cave, became a beacon for scientists, historians, and tourists from around the globe. It brought jobs, investment, and a sense of pride that was authentic, earned through the celebration of truth, rather than the acceptance of a comfortable lie. In a stroke of cosmic justice, the very discovery Thorne had killed to conceal ended up bringing more genuine good to his community than his lifetime of corrupt generosity ever could. The mountain, once a symbol of a dark secret, was now the region's greatest asset, its value measured not in dollars, but in knowledge. Eleanor Vance's name was now spoken with the reverence once reserved for legendary explorers. She was no longer a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to scare new cavers. She was a scientific martyr, a hero whose final, brilliant discovery had been reclaimed from the darkness. Universities posthumously granted her the honors she had been denied in life, and her field notebook, once a waterlogged relic, was now a priceless artifact displayed at the heart of the museum dedicated to her work. Her story became a mandatory part of the curriculum for young geologists, a powerful lesson in the integrity of science and the personal courage required to pursue truth, no matter the cost. Her legacy was no longer defined by her death, but immortalized by the monumental discovery she made at the end of her life. The entire saga became a modern parable about the nature of truth itself. It showed that a lie, even one sealed with concrete and protected by decades of power and influence, is inherently unstable. It is a fragile construction that cannot withstand the persistent, focused pressure of a single individual armed with a righteous cause. Thorne's conspiracy was a fortress built on a foundation of sand, and Ethan's quest was the slow, rising tide that inevitably washed it all away. The story of Stillwater Caverns proved that truth has its own form of gravity. It can be hidden, buried, and denied, but it will always, eventually, pull itself to the surface, demanding to be seen. The darkness of the cave had held a secret, but it couldn't hold it forever. However, a lingering question remained, a loose thread in the otherwise neatly resolved tapestry. While Marcus Thorne and his crew were brought to justice, the international network that purchased the priceless artifacts from him was never fully dismantled. The financial trail went cold in a series of offshore accounts and shadowy art dealerships in Europe and Asia. The buyers, the wealthy and powerful individuals who fueled Thorne's greed by creating a market for stolen history, remained anonymous ghosts. They were the silent partners in his crime, their hands just as stained with the blood of Eleanor Vance, yet they faced no consequences. Their identities remain a secret, another mystery waiting in the wings, a chilling reminder that for every villain exposed, others continue to operate freely in the shadows. The conviction of Marcus Thorne closed a single, painful chapter, but the vast, shadowy world of black market antiquities remains untouched. The powerful, faceless buyers who funded his crimes are still out there, ready to finance the next plunderer, and that is a story that reaches far beyond the hills of Kentucky. If you want to see us investigate these networks and expose the secrets they're still hiding, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments, what do you think is the biggest secret in the world that is still waiting to be uncovered? And what would you do if you were the one to find the first clue? For Ethan Vance, the future was an open, unwritten page for the first time in his life. He sold his architectural firm, the life he had built as a monument to order and control, and used the funds to establish the Eleanor Vance Foundation. Its mission was twofold: to fund ethical speleological research and to provide legal support for whistleblowers and investigators who, like him, were fighting to expose corruption and reclaim buried truths. He was no longer building structures of steel and glass. He was building a legacy of his own, one that transformed the pain of his past into a shield for others. He was no longer defined by his mother's absence, but inspired by her enduring presence, ensuring no other explorer's discovery would ever be silenced in the dark again. In the end, the story always came back to the small brass compass. It had been a gift from a mother to her son, a simple tool meant to guide him home. For 18 years it sat in a drawer, a symbol of a direction he had lost. But it was never just a navigational device. It was a moral instrument, its needle pointing not just to magnetic north, but to the unwavering constant of truth. It guided him through the labyrinth of the cave, and the far more treacherous labyrinth of human deceit. It was a physical piece of his mother's integrity, a silent, powerful reminder that even in the most absolute darkness, there is always a true north to be found, if one has the courage to look for it. The final lesson of Stillwater Caverns is not one of geology, but of humanity. It teaches us that the most terrifying darkness is not found miles beneath the surface of the earth, sealed in ancient rock. It is found in the calculated silence of powerful men, in the quiet corruption that thrives just beneath the surface of our everyday world. And the most powerful light is not the beam of a headlamp cutting through the black. It is the stubborn, unyielding love of a son who refused to let his mother's story end as a lie, proving that even a single voice searching for truth can be enough to make a mountain move.